Every year, Annie. 10 winters of back taxes on your place, paid quiet at the county window, and I never once meant for you to know. Between them on the kitchen table lay a stack of folded receipts, gone soft at the creases from handling. Beside them, a ring of ranch keys, the brass worn pale where her thumb had rubbed it for a decade. Outside, snow ticked against the glass. She was 33 years old, and she had buried her husband 10 years back and had never once let a soul carry a bucket for her because she had learned early what happened to people who leaned. Now the county's livestock inspector had chalked a false quarantine across her gate 3 days before the fall sale, and every head of cattle she owned stood eating money she did not have. If that quarantine held, the ranch went, and with it the last thing on this earth with her name written on it. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me what you would have said to him in that last room if it had been you standing there. I read every single one. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, and I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one. So why would a quiet man, a man who kept his hat on and his ledgers shut, spend 10 years spending his own money to hold up a life that had never asked him to? And what was she truly afraid of? All those years of saying no thank you, I can manage. Before we go back to the depot platform in Larkspur, Kansas, on the day the bride's train ran 3 hours late, tell me where you are watching from tonight. The autumn before that kitchen, on a Tuesday in September, the bride's train out of Kansas City ran 3 hours late, and half of Larkspur stood on the depot platform waiting to see what it carried. Annie Maddox was not waiting for a bride. She was waiting for glass. 8 panes packed in straw inside a crate, stenciled with a hardware company's name in Topeka, bought with money she had earned selling 40 pounds of butter over the summer in half-pound rounds wrapped in cheesecloth. The panes were for the Schoolhouse on the Cottonwood Road, where 3 windows had been boarded since a hailstorm 2 springs back, and the children read by lamplight at 10 in the morning. Nobody had asked her to buy them. Nobody knew she had. She stood at the far end of the platform in a gray dress with a mended cuff and a hat that had been good in 1868, and she let the crowd have the middle. The crowd had things to say. Not to her. Around her, which is a different thing and a colder one. You already know how that kind of quiet feels. The kind where people lower their voices a little when you pass and then raise them again after, and what they lower them over is you. 10 years that October. 10 years since she had stood in the churchyard with her hands folded while they put Thomas Maddox in the ground, and 10 years since she had said to every man and woman who offered, "Thank you, I can manage." She had said it to the Bledsoes when they came with a wagon and 2 sons to cut her hay. She had said it to Pastor Lyle Prentice when the deacons took up a collection and he brought it to her door in a tobacco tin. "Thank you, I can manage." She had handed the tin back with the lid still on. They had stopped offering somewhere around the 4th year. That was not cruelty. That was people believing what a woman told them. She was 33 years old. In Larkspur, Kansas, in that decade, a woman of 33 with no husband and no children and 160 acres of grass, she worked with 2 hired hands in June, and nobody at all the rest of the year was not a tragedy. She was a category. Cora Bledsoe called her that poor Maddox woman with real feeling in it. Hattie Voss at the Mercantile called her a wonder, and meant it, and still put the sugar sacks where Annie could not reach them without asking. And when the bride's train finally came grinding in at 4:20, hissing steam across the boards, and the 4 young women came down the steps in traveling coats with their hair pinned fresh, Annie watched Jedediah Quimby's wife lean toward Cora and say low that some of us waited too long to be wanted, and I do not say it unkind. Annie heard it. She kept her eyes on the freight car. That was the thing about being spoken of like weather. You were expected not to mind. Her father had taught her not to mind. Ezra Cobb had come up from Ohio and filed on a quarter section 40 miles west of there when Annie was 9, and he had broken sod with a mule named Pilot and a plow with a cracked handle wrapped in wire, and he had proved up that claim on paper in the last week of March. The certificate came in an envelope. The bank's notice came in the same week's mail. She remembered him sitting at the table with both papers in front of him, one hand on each, as if he were weighing them, and she remembered that he laughed. Not bitter, just short, the way a man laughs when a joke is played on him well. He said, "Well, there it is, Annie girl. Owned it fair on Friday and lost it fair on Saturday." He never asked anyone for a thing after that. He died in a rented room in Abilene with $11 in his coat and his name still good, and she had understood, at 14, exactly what he had traded for that and had decided it was worth the price. So when the freight door rolled back and the agent, Del Ferry, called out that the Maddox crate had come through, but that it was heavier than a person, she said she would manage. She had her wagon back to the platform edge and the tailgate down. The crate was 4 feet across, and the straw inside made it awkward more than heavy, and she got her arms under one end and lifted, and the boards shifted, and glass spoke inside it the way glass does, that small, dry warning. A gloved hand came in under the other end. She did not see him arrive. That was the first thing she would remember about Ulysses Graves. Later, when she had years to sort it, that he was simply there, on the far side of the weight, taking it before she could tell him not to. He was 44 years old and looked it in the way a fence post looks its age, weathered pale and set deep, beard gone iron at the jaw, hat on, brim low, and it stayed on. He wore a coat that had been expensive maybe 12 years ago and had been mended at the elbow by somebody competent. Together, they set the crate down in the wagon bed without a sound from the glass. She said, "I had it." He said, "I know." That was all. He did not say ma'am, and he did not say let me, and he did not stand there afterward with his weight on one hip waiting to be thanked. He looked at the crate a moment, at the stenciled address, at the shape of it, and then he reached into the wagon and pushed the crate 6 inches forward so it sat over the axle instead of behind it, where the road would have shaken it apart before she made the creek. "Ride's better there," he said. Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked off down the platform toward the stock pens, and a man Annie did not know called out to him about a bull, and he answered something she could not hear. No questions, no pity, just those 5 words. She stood there with her hand flat on the crate lid, and the steam still drifting, and the 4 brides being introduced to 4 men in clean collars 20 feet away, and she felt a thing she did not have a name for and did not want one for. Then she climbed up, took the lines, and drove out the Cottonwood Road to the schoolhouse, because the light held until 7, and she wanted one window in before dark. There were parts of that man's life she had only seen the edges of. She would not know for a long while that the tax on her ranch for that year and the 9 before it had already been paid. The next Saturday, she came out the Cottonwood Road at 5:30 with the second pane wrapped in a quilt on the seat beside her, and there was smoke coming out of the schoolhouse chimney. She sat in the wagon a full minute before she got down. The door was propped with a stone. Inside, the little sheet iron stove had been lit and fed and shut down to a slow draw, so the room stood at that temperature where your fingers still work. On the teacher's desk sat a paper sack of cut nails, the 8-penny kind she had been buying 11 at a time, because a whole pound cost 40 cents and 40 cents was butter. There was no note. There was no one there. She set the pane in the frame that evening with warm hands, and the putty went smooth instead of crumbling, and when she was done, She stood back and looked at the window and at the stove and did not let herself finish the thought. 10 days later, at the Mercantile, Hattie Voss said something that stayed with her. Annie had brought in 9 rounds of butter, half a pound each, wrapped in cheesecloth and pressed with the little wooden mold that had been Thomas's mother's. She always brought them Wednesday. Hattie always took 6 and said the rest would turn before she could move them. That Wednesday, Hattie took all 9 and wrote the credit and said, without looking up, "You could bring me 20 and I would take 20. Annie asked why. "Because they go," Hattie said. "Same fellow. Comes in Thursday, buys out whatever's on the butter shelf, every last round, pays cash. I asked him once what on earth he does with it, and he said, his hands eat." Annie stood with the credit slip in her hand and made herself breathe once before she asked the next question, and then she did not ask it. Another small thing she noticed. She had never once in 10 years been able to sell a Wednesday's butter by Thursday. Through October, the ritual set itself, the way a bone sets, without either of them naming it. Saturdays she worked the schoolhouse. She had told nobody that. She had started the spring before, after Cora Bledsoe's youngest came down with the croup from sitting under the boarded window in a draft, and Annie had gone out one evening with a hammer and a bucket of lath scraps and had simply kept going. 3rd Saturday of the month she scrubbed the floor. The others she did what the building needed, which was everything, and every Saturday there was something. Not much, never enough to argue with. One week, a length of pine plank, planed, leaning inside the door where a floorboard had gone soft at the threshold. One week, a full pound of nails. One week, the stove lit and a bucket of coal beside it, and the coal was good coal, hard and shiny, not the slack that people burned when they were being careful. One week, nothing at all but the water bucket filled and set back exactly where she kept it, on the left of the door, handle turned out. She had never told a living soul that she kept it handle out so she could grab it in the dark. She began to arrive later on purpose to catch him. He was never there. Twice she saw a horse's tracks in the road dust, a big-footed animal, shod fresh. Once, at the end of the month, she came at 4 instead of 5, and there he was on the roof. Ulysses Graves, 44 years old, sitting on the ridge of a one-room schoolhouse with his hat on and a hammer in his hand, laying a shingle over the place where the rain came through above the stovepipe. She stood in the yard and looked up at him. "You are on my roof," she said. He drove the nail. 2 strokes. Said, "It is the county's roof." She said, "I have been fixing it." He said, "I know." Then he moved down a course and set another shingle and said, without looking at her, "You are not fast enough alone before the freeze," which was true, and which was the only argument she had ever heard that she could not answer, because it was not about her at all. It was about the roof. She climbed up and handed him shingles. That was how the first month went. Not thanks, not talk. Just shingles going up from her hand to his, and the smell of cedar, and the light going orange on the boards, and once, when she passed him the last one, their fingers almost touched. Almost. By the first week of November, the cold came in with a wind out of the north that made the grass lie flat all one way, and the ritual changed clothes but not shape. He took to being there when she arrived instead of leaving before. He never came inside past the stove. He would do whatever was highest or heaviest, and then he would stand near the door with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets while she puttied or swept, and he would say maybe 40 words in an hour. She learned to read him the way you read weather off a horizon. Another small thing she noticed. When he set a tool down, he set it down pointing away from her, handle toward her hand. Another. He never asked her a single question about her husband, or her father, or her 160 acres, or why a woman of 33 was out at a country schoolhouse after dark in November with a putty knife. He asked her once whether the west sash rattled in a wind, and once whether the children complained more of the cold in the morning or the afternoon, and once whether the well rope was hemp or wire. "Afternoon," she said, "and hemp, and it is going." The next Saturday, there was 30 feet of new wire rope coiled by the well, and she stood over it a long moment with her arms crossed, calculating what it cost, which was more than she had spent on herself in a year. She said, "I cannot pay you for that." He said, "It is not yours. It is the school's well." And there it was again, the door he kept leaving open for her so she could walk through it without owing anybody. She thought about that on the drive home in the dark. A man who wanted to be thanked would have made sure she knew it was for her. The second week of November, snow came early and light and did not stay, and Cora Bledsoe stopped Annie outside the church to say that somebody had put glass in the schoolhouse, and did she know a thing about it? Because the Wickham girl had read a whole page out loud at 9 in the morning without a lamp. Annie said she had heard something about it. Cora looked at her a beat too long and then said, "Well, whoever it was, that was the first stone." Annie did not know it yet. By December there was a rhythm to it that she caught herself keeping time to on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, waiting for Saturday, which frightened her more than the quarantine ever would. They talked more, not much more. The talk had the same shape as the work. He said his outfit ran east of the creek and that he had come into the county about 12 years back with a string of horses and a note he did not like the terms of. He said it the way a man mentions the weather in a year-long past. She had heard, second-hand, that Graves shipped cattle. She had also heard Del Ferry at the depot say Graves had loaded 14 cars in 1 week that fall, and Annie had done sums in her head that night, lying in bed the way she used to do sums, and the number she got was not a number that belonged to a man with a mended elbow. She did not ask. She understood the courtesy of not asking. She had been asked things. Because once, for one season, when she was 19 and her father was 2 years dead and she had no place, Annie Cobb had kept the books for a traveling theater troupe out of St. Joseph. 12 people, 4 trunks, a canvas drop with a painted Italian garden on it. She had counted the door money in a tin box and paid the boarding houses and learned exactly how a man can stand in a doorway with his hat in both hands and produce real tears about a dead mother he never had. She had watched them do grief for 40 cents a head, 6 nights a week, and had learned it like a language, and had never once told a soul in Larkspur that those months existed, because she knew precisely what the word actress would do to a widow's credit at the Mercantile. She thought of it, that December, only because Ulysses Graves was the least performed man she had ever stood next to. Another small thing she noticed. He never once looked to see whether anybody was watching him help her. The Saturday before Christmas, the wind came hard enough that they gave up on the sash and sat on opposite sides of the stove with the door shut, and she found she had nothing to say and did not mind. After a while he said, "You have got a good hand with putty." She said, "My father taught me. He proved up a claim the same week the bank took it." Ulysses Graves looked at the stove. He said, "Then he proved up." She sat with that. Nobody in 20 years had said it that way, as if the paper counted and the loss was just weather. She looked at her hands in her lap and let the stove tick, and outside the snow started in earnest, and neither of them moved to go. By the second week of January, the talk had found a shape, and the shape had her in it. It started, as those things do, with something true. Hattie Voss told Cora Bledsoe that a man bought out her butter shelf every Thursday and paid cash, and Cora told her sister-in-law that the man was Graves, and somebody, and Annie never learned who, said the words out loud in the Mercantile, that Ulysses Graves was paying above market for butter he did not need from a widow he had been seen on a roof with. Kept. That was the word that got carried, not said to her. carried past her, at the post window, in the church vestibule, the way you carry a hot dish, both hands, careful, eyes down. She kept her chin level and bought her nails 11 at a time. Then, on the last Friday of the month, Jedediah Quimby came out the Cottonwood Road in a buggy with the county seal painted on the side and stood at her water gap with a tally book. He was the county's livestock inspector, and he was married to Thomas Maddox's sister, which made him family in the way a fence is family to a field. He had a soft voice and a way of sighing before bad news that Annie had heard before, in a canvas theater with a painted Italian garden behind it, 6 nights a week, 40 cents a head. He said he hated to be the one. He said the water in her lower draw had been reported. He said there had been mange in the county, and he had a duty, and that he had told his wife, just last night, Annie, that it grieved him, a woman alone, working her brother-in-law's place all these years, when by rights. He did not finish that sentence. He never did. What he left, instead, was paper, a notation on her water, a hold on her shipping certificate pending reinspection at his convenience. Annie read it twice at the kitchen table that night and understood the arithmetic. Without a certificate, she could not ship. Without shipping, she could not pay the note at the bank in Larkspur. And the fall sale, the only sale in that county that ever paid a fair figure, was 9 months out and already, on a piece of paper in a tally book, closed to her. She also understood something else, and it sat colder. In 4 years of Quimby's inspections, she could not recall one mark set against a single head belonging to the big outfit south of the tracks. Not a hoof. Not once. Somebody was paying for that steadiness, and it was not the county. Here is what the talk did next, and it did it fast, the way fire goes through cured grass. A woman under quarantine notation is a woman with dirty water. A woman with dirty water who has a wealthy man buying her butter is a woman with an arrangement. By the middle of February, Pastor Lyle Prentice preached on the tongue as a small member that boasteth great things and looked at nobody, and half the pews looked at Annie. So what did she do? She protected him. Not herself. Him. That is the part I want you to sit with, because it cost her the only warm hour she had in a week. The last Saturday in February, she came out the Cottonwood Road at first light instead of 5 o'clock, and she was gone before 3, and there was no smoke in the chimney because she had not let it be lit. She did that again the Saturday after. The third time, she left a folded note under a stone on the schoolhouse step, and it said only this: "Mr. Graves, the school is grateful. Do not come out here again. Your name is worth more in this county than my roof." She drove home and unhitched in the dark and did not cry, because she had learned at 14 what crying bought. Another small thing she noticed, and it was the worst one. The following Saturday, the wire rope by the well had been coiled again, neat, hung on a nail somebody had driven for the purpose. Coal by the stove. The bucket on the left of the door, handle turned out. No note, no argument. Just the work, still being done, by a man doing what she had asked and coming anyway when she was not there. She stood in that cold room with her hand on the doorframe for a long moment. 11 seconds, maybe. Long enough to want to go find him and no longer be able to. Outside, March was coming, and with it the bank's letter. The bank's letter came on the 9th of March, a printed form with her name written into the blank in a clerk's careful hand, and it said what such letters say. The note fell due in October and would be satisfied out of the fall sale or out of other arrangements. Other arrangements, 2 words doing the work of a shovel. She put the letter in the drawer with her father's proving up certificate, which was the only place in the house where it made any sense. 5 days later, the storm came. It came up warm out of the southwest, the way the bad ones do, so warm that she took her coat off at noon and hung it on the corral post. By 3, the wind had swung around north, and the temperature was falling so fast she could feel it on her teeth. By 4, it was sleet. By 5, it was snow going sideways with weight in it, and she had 9 heifers in the lower draw carrying their first calves. You have stood in a wind like that. It does not push. It leans, steady, with both hands on your chest, and it finds the seam of every button. She worked from 4 o'clock into the dark, walking them up out of the draw 1 and 2 at a time, ice building in her eyelashes until she had to break it off with her thumbnail. The 4th heifer went down in the willows and would not rise. Annie got the rope on the calf's forelegs and set her heels in the frozen mud and pulled, and it came, and it breathed, and she was wet to the shoulders in a wind that was turning the wet to shell. She was on the 6th heifer when she saw the lantern coming across the flat. 2 lanterns, a wagon behind them, and 3 riders, and one of them was Ulysses Graves with his hat tied down under his jaw with a length of piggin string, which was the only concession to whether she ever saw that man make. He did not ask what she needed. He counted heifers, looked at the corral, looked at the north rail where the wind was coming through like water through a sieve, and said, "We will want a break on that side." Then he went to the wagon and pulled the canvas back. Blankets. Gray wool, folded, stacked to the sideboards. Not 2 of them or 4, but 11. Later, Hattie Voss told it in the Mercantile herself, told it to anybody who stood still, how Graves had come in at 2 in the afternoon with the sky going green and asked how many blankets she had on the shelf, and she said 11, and he said all of them, and paid cash, and did not haggle and did not explain, and drove out the Cottonwood Road with them while the road was closing behind him. They hung 9 of those blankets over the north rails of Annie's corral, lashed with wire, a wall of wool going stiff with ice, and they wrapped the 2 wet calves in the last 2 and set them in the lee of the barn wall on straw. By 11 o'clock, they had all 9 heifers up and 8 calves living. 1 they lost. She knelt in the snow with her hand on its side for a moment before she got up, and nobody said anything about it, and she was grateful for that past all telling. The road was gone by then, drifted belly deep at the creek crossing. His 2 hands took the barn and the hay. Ulysses Graves stood in her yard as if he intended to stand there until morning, and Annie said, "Get in the house before I have to thaw you out with the stock," and he came. He took his hat off inside her door. She had known that man 5 months and had never once seen his hair, and it was gray at the temples and flattened in a ring, and she looked away from it fast because it felt like seeing him with his coat off. She made coffee. He sat where Thomas used to sit because it was the chair that was there, and put both hands around the cup, and the stove ticked, and the wind hunted along the eaves. She said, "The bank wrote me. October." He said, "I heard." She said, "You should know what it is you have been buying butter from." And then she told him. Sitting there in a wet dress with her hair down her back at midnight in March, she told Ulysses Graves the one thing she had never told a living soul in Larkspur, Kansas. That at 19, with her father 2 years dead and no place on this earth to stand, Annie Cobb had gone out with a traveling theater troupe from St. Joseph and kept their books. 12 people, 4 trunks. A canvas drop with a painted Italian garden on it, 6 nights a week, 40 cents a head. She had counted the door money in a tin box and paid the boarding houses and argued with the hall keeper in Hannibal over $3 and won. She said the word actress out loud and told him exactly what that word would do to a widow's credit if it ever got loose in that county. Then she stopped and waited for his face to do something. It did not. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the table and said, 12 people ate for a season because you could count. She said, "That is not how it would be told." He said, "It is how it happened." Then after a while, plainly, the way a man says a fence needs a staple. "I have got a spare room out at my place. East window. Bed in it. Nobody in it since I built the house. If they take this ground in October, you come out and take that room, and you keep your own name, and you keep your own keys, and you owe me nothing but a seat at your table when you set one. It was not pity, and it was not a proposal, just a room with an east window. She looked at the table for a long time. When she looked up, he had set the cup down, with the handle turned toward her hand, the way he set down every tool he ever put down near her. She said, "And if I say no thank you, I can manage." He said, "Then you manage and the room stays empty, and it is no trouble to me either way." That was the bravest thing that man ever did, and he did it in about 9 seconds without ever raising his voice. The storm quit near dawn. By 7, his hands had a track broken to the creek, and the sun came up hard and white on all that new snow. He went out with his hat back on and his coat buttoned wrong, and the 9 blankets stayed lashed to Annie Maddox's North Corral rails, gray wool gone to iron in the cold, where every single soul who traveled the Cottonwood Road that next week could see them and count them and ask. The week after the storm, people counted blankets. That is a small thing to hang a life on, but that is how it went. 9 gray blankets lashed with wire to the north rails of a widow's corral, going white with frost and thawing black in the afternoons, and every wagon on the Cottonwood Road slowing down to look. Del Ferry counted them out loud at the depot. 9 on the rail and 2 on the calves, he said, and Hattie sold him 11, and I know because I asked her. Hattie Voss did not wait to be asked twice. She told it over the counter for a month. How a man came in at 2 in the afternoon with the sky going green and bought every blanket she had and paid cash and did not explain himself and drove out a road that was closing behind him. The story people had been carrying changed hands and changed shape. It had been a story about an arrangement. It became a story about 8 calves living. Cora Bledsoe came out in April with a jar of pear preserves and did not knock in the way people knock when they are bringing charity. She stood in the kitchen with her coat still buttoned and said, "My youngest sat under a boarded window and near died of it, and now she reads at 9 in the morning without a lamp, and I know who bought that glass, Annie, and I know how." "Butter," Annie said. 40 pounds of it, Cora said. Hattie told me. The county board met in Larkspur on the 2nd Tuesday of May in the hall behind the land office to hear standing business, and one item of standing business was a hold on a shipping certificate belonging to A. Maddox, pending reinspection at the inspector's convenience. Annie went in a gray dress with a mended cuff. She sat in the 3rd row. Ulysses Graves stood at the back by the door with his hat in his hands and said nothing at all the entire hour, and she knew he was there without turning around, the way you know a stove is lit. Jedediah Quimby spoke first. He came up to the front and set his tally book down and took his hat off and held it in both hands at the level of his belt, and he let a silence run about 4 seconds before he began, and Annie felt something in her chest go very still and very cold and very clear. He spoke of duty. He spoke of the mange that had come through the county in the year of the hard winter. He spoke of his wife's brother, Thomas Maddox, dead these 10 years, God rest him, and how the man had trusted him, and how it grieved him past bearing to stand up in a public room and speak of a woman alone. His voice caught on the word alone. It caught in exactly the same place it had caught the first time, out at her water gap in January. The handkerchief was already in his hand before his eyes were wet. Annie Maddox had counted door money in a tin box for a season, 6 nights a week, 40 cents a head. She had paid boarding houses for 12 people who could weep on cue and mean none of it, and she knew the pause before the line, and the tremor pitched to reach the back row, and the grief that arrives too promptly to have traveled any distance. She did not stand up and say so. She could have. I want you to understand that she could have taken that room apart with about 9 sentences, and that she was the only person in it who had the tools. There was no revenge in it, and no scene, just her hands folded in her lap. When the chairman asked her whether she cared to answer, she stood and said she would like the water in her lower draw tested by the state man out of Topeka at her own expense, and she would like the result written into the record either way. Then she sat down. What happened after that took 40 minutes and had nothing to do with her. Del Ferry said that in September he had watched that woman get under a 4-foot crate of window glass by herself for a schoolhouse that was not hers. Hattie Voss said Annie Maddox had never once asked for credit in 10 years and had never once been late. Wickham said his girl read a whole page aloud at 9 in the morning now without a lamp, and asked mildly whether the board knew who had put the glass in, because he had only just learned it himself. Pastor Lyle Prentice stood up last. He said he had preached in February on the tongue as a small member that boasteth great things, and that he had aimed that sermon at the wrong pew, and he was sorry for it, and he would say so again on Sunday from the same place. Nobody looked at Quimby while he answered. That was the whole of it. He talked for a while longer, and the chairman thanked him, and the clerk wrote, and men began finding their hats. The state man came out the first week of June, and the water tested clean. The hold came off. The certificate came back in an envelope with her name written into the blank in a clerk's careful hand, and she stood in her own kitchen and read it twice. Another small thing she noticed. Her hands were steady. Jedediah Quimby kept his job and his buggy with the seal painted on the side. He rode that county for years after, but his notations got read twice from then on, and the big outfit south of the tracks quietly stopped needing his help. And at the church suppers, where he had once done the whispering, he was the thing whispered about, kindly and briefly, and then set down. Nobody was cruel to him. Nobody listened to him either. She shipped in October. The note was paid on a Thursday, and the bank's clerk wrote her name into the blank, and the ground stayed hers. The receipts turned up in November in a drawer at the county window when she went in to ask a plain question about her own account, and the man behind the glass got flustered and honest. So it was December when she put them on the kitchen table with the snow ticking at the glass and made him sit in the chair that was there. Every year, Annie. 10 winters of back taxes on your place, paid quiet at the county window, and I never once meant for you to know. She did not hand them back. She had handed a tobacco tin back once, with the lid still on, and she had spent 10 years learning what that cost her. Instead, she picked up the ring of ranch keys, brass worn pale where her thumb had rubbed it for a decade, and she worked one key off the ring and set it on the table between them, beside the receipts, and slid it under his hand. "Barn's yours to walk into," she said. "Knock or do not." He looked at it a long while. Then he put it in his coat pocket, the mended one. By April, the grass came green in the lower draw, and the schoolhouse windows were all glass, and he came Saturdays, and she quit pretending she was not counting the days between. When I think about them, I do not think about the storm. I think about a key coming off a ring in a warm kitchen, and a woman deciding that being known was not the same as being kept. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. If you'd like more quiet evenings by the fire, lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home, come back for the next one.